A deeply divided America is headed to the polls to elect its 47th president after an unprecedented campaign that has included ugly insults, two assassination attempts, a criminal conviction for one of the candidates, a surprise nomination for the other, and constant misinformation that has left voters split over basic facts. Here to help us predict how it will all unfold from the US Study Centre and the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Sydney, Associate Professor David Smith. David, how are you feeling right now?
I think that this is the most unpredictable election I've ever seen. Certainly, it is the closest election in the history of modern polling, where both the national polls and the polls in all of the key swing states are indicating a race that is so deeply within the margin of error that it is really impossible to predict from the polling alone. It's really remarkable that we're at this point because the polls have been so close for so long. Normally, in the course of a presidential election, somebody pulls ahead at some point. This has just never really happened in this election. And the result is that no outcome would be entirely surprising. There's been a lot of speculation that Kamala Harris could win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College, which is, of course, what happened to Hillary Clinton in 2016. But there's a possibility that Donald Trump could win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College as well. Neither outcome would be a total surprise at this point. So, yeah, I think that the election's going to be decided by people who are making decisions at the last moment about whether to vote or not. And we won't be able to see until tomorrow how they have decided.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the polls because we've seen in plenty of high-profile voting situations in the past where the polls have got it completely wrong. Based on what we know about American politics, the fact that it isn't compulsory voting, so a lot depends on who can actually be motivated to go and vote on the day. If the polls do get it wrong, which way do you think they're more likely to be wrong?
That's a very good question because there are two reasons why polls can go wrong. One is that people make their decisions at the last moment after polls have stopped being conducted. That was part of the story with 2016. But the other way is that there's a response bias in the polls. So that is when pollsters are contacting people, more people who support one side are answering the poll in the first place, which is really what happened in 2020. There's a lot of concern that the response bias in 2020, which is that Donald Trump supporters are people who are a bit less engaged with politics, don't trust media organisations and universities who conduct the polls, that it's very hard to correct for that. But one way that pollsters have of doing it is by looking at the people who are answering their polls and weighting the responses based on how people voted in the last election. So, in other words, if you see that only 35% of your sample voted for Donald Trump in the election, you give those voters more weight in the poll. They go from being a 1 to a 1.3 or a 1.4 in order to get a more representative sample. That may be why the polls have been so close this time, because so many of the pollsters are using this weighting to try to make sure that they include Donald Trump supporters, which means that you have a picture that looks a lot like the last election, which in the swing states was very close. So that might be one way that pollsters can mitigate that problem, but that can create problems of its own. People don't always remember accurately who it was they voted for in the last election, which is what pollsters have to ask people. And also, this could end up leading to an underestimation of Kamala Harris's support. So it really could go either way. In terms of how late-breaking voters are going to decide, the conventional wisdom is late-breaking voters vote for the challenger candidate. In this election, it's not really clear who that is because Donald Trump has been president before. Kamala Harris hasn't been president but has been vice president. Certainly, Democrats at the moment are optimistic that late deciding voters are voting for Kamala Harris. There was a poll in the New York Times over the weekend that suggested Harris had a lead with late deciding voters. But again, we're only really going to be able to see on the day itself how all this pans out.
Well, let's break it down by candidate. And I'd love for you to tell us what is the most likely path for victory for each of them. So let's start with Donald Trump. What does he have to achieve to win the White House?
So Donald Trump has had small leads in most of the so-called Sun Belt states, that is North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. And certainly his campaign at the moment is projecting a lot of confidence in winning those states. His biggest lead in those is in Arizona. He won North Carolina in both the 2016 and 2020 elections. They're confident of getting Georgia back. Nevada's always a bit of a wild card. But if Trump could win all of those, then he only needs to win one of the Midwestern states, one of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. For Kamala Harris, the campaign has really been focused on those three states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. If she can win those, then she should be able to get the barest margin of victory in the Electoral College, assuming that she wins Nebraska's 2nd district as well, where she seems to have quite a substantial lead. So those are the two real paths. If Kamala Harris were able to win one of those Sunbelt states, either North Carolina or Georgia seem to be the ones where she's polling best, then that would open up a whole lot of new scenarios, because if she won one of those, then Donald Trump could win one of the northern states and still lose. So the focus really is on all of those 7 states. There was another wrinkle, though, that opened up over the weekend when there's a very surprising poll that showed Kamala Harris winning in Iowa by 3 points. And poll averages in Iowa have shown Donald Trump up by about 8 points. The reason why this poll caused such a stir is because this poll in the past has been famous for being both unusual and accurate. So in 2020, when the poll averages were showing an almost even race, just before the election, this company Seltzer published a poll showing that Trump was in front by 7 points in Iowa. He ended up winning the state by 8. Similarly, back in 2016, they published a poll showing he was in front by 8. When the rest of the polls showed he was only in front by 3, he won by 8. So the fact that this poll is now showing Kamala Harris in front by 3, and this pollster, she has said she used exactly the same methodology she used in 2016 and 2020, is causing a lot of optimism among Democrats. Even if this poll is an outlier, and they don't really expect to win Iowa, but even if it's only wrong by 5 points, a lead that is that close in Iowa, which is a state that Trump won by 8 points in the last 2 elections, could indicate that Harris has a lot of hidden strength in the Midwest. And this poll in particular showed her doing very well with older women. Harris's campaign has really been focused on women, and it's had a particular focus on women who might have voted Republican in the past but are now sick of Trump, the kinds of women who voted for Nikki Haley in the Republican primaries. A poll like that in Iowa might suggest that Harris has had some cut through with that group, especially among voters who are deciding late.
There's so many unknowns, so many variables. It's actually dizzying when you try and get your head around it all. And in terms of when we are likely to find out, like anything tangible, result-wise, to the surprise of nobody listening today, each state has its own rules and regulations around when polls close, when voting starts, what they do with early voting. It's a basket case. But in terms of when we might actually know something that we could believe with any conviction, when do you think that will be?
It really depends. So last time, obviously, it took a very long time to learn the results. We didn't really know for 4 days. Pennsylvania and Wisconsin have quite slow counting procedures when it comes to mail-in ballots. So if it comes down to those states, it could take a while. But this year, there's some indication that Republicans and Democrats have been voting early and voting by mail in roughly equal numbers. And there's some indication that they're likely to vote on election day in roughly equal numbers as well. What that would mean is there wouldn't be such a big difference between the early votes and the election day votes as there was last time around, which means we might actually have a clearer idea earlier on this time. So in 2016, it was reasonably clear in Australia by about 3 or 4 in the afternoon Eastern time, around 1 or 2 in the afternoon in Western Australia. It could be like that again this time. So the eastern state polls, most of them close at 10 a.m. Eastern time Australia, 8 a.m. Western Australian time. The critical ones in the Midwest close about 3 hours later. And so I think it'll be, around middle of the day, early afternoon. We'll at least know by then whether we're going to get a result quickly or whether it's going to be a more drawn out counting contest.
And then in terms of what might happen as the result becomes clearer, what are the fears in America at the moment that if Trump should look like he is not doing well, that there could be followers of his who will try to interrupt the vote count, interrupt the process, and potentially violently?
That is a definite fear. And there has been a lot poured into election security this year. There have been police being trained in election law so that they know how to respond to disruptions and challenges. There's been a lot of care taken for the security of electoral workers who are often subject to threats or violent harassment. The Trump campaign is certainly going to invest a lot in legal challenges if Trump loses. The legal challenges that they can pursue are fairly narrow. When we consider that in the last election, the closest result was 10,000 votes, there's almost no legal challenge that is going to be able to overcome a 10,000 vote gap, no matter what irregularities people can find. It's very unlikely that 10,000 votes can be overcome. The main tactic has been around just trying to delay certification for as long as possible, in the hope that, say, if Harris wins 270 electoral college votes, if they could delay certification in one state like Wisconsin, then they could prevent her from getting to that 270 votes, and then the election would have to be decided in the House of Representatives, which Republicans would win. That's very, very long shot stuff, though. When you consider that when it comes to electoral legal challenges, courts are primed to hear them very quickly. Any kind of lawsuit around an election gets expedited very quickly so that it's heard within days. So these kinds of challenges tend to get resolved fairly quickly. Last time around, the Trump campaign tried to draw them out for as long as possible, but they were basically all finished by the middle of November, which is well before the deadlines. What we could see is if it comes down, though, to a really close result, something like in Florida in 2000, where it's fewer than 1,000 votes, those are the sort of circumstances where legal challenges can actually succeed. Because in every election where there are tens of millions of votes, you do have hundreds of irregularities, not usually anything to do with voting fraud, but you do get ballots that go missing, you get information that gets entered improperly. You get people who have voted in the wrong place or spoiled their ballots in some way. You do get hundreds of these instances. So if it's less than 1,000 votes, that's when legal challenges can really amount to something. Some of the avenues for legal challenge that existed last time have been cut off. So the Supreme Court has rejected a conservative theory that state legislatures should be able to block election results if they think that they've contradicted state law. There's also been changes to the Electoral Count Act, which means that it's much harder for members of Congress to protest electoral college votes. So some of those challenges have been cut off. But with every state making its own election law, you can be sure that Trump's lawyers in every state are examining every law possible to see what avenues of appeal and protest there are that can stretch out the delays for as long as possible.
World's most powerful democracy, apparently. I'm going to let you go, David. But before I do, everything we know about Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, but in particular, in Trump's presidency and then everything that has happened since then, to what extent do you think this vote will be a referendum on the American people and who exactly they are in the eyes of the rest of the world?
Yeah, good question. I think to some extent, the world has got quite used to Donald Trump now. The rest of the world is not as shocked by Donald Trump as it used to be. And if you look at the way that leaders of other countries have been making preparations for this election, including in Australia, there seems to be quite a wide degree of acceptance that Trump has, at least an even chance of winning this election, and other countries are going to be prepared to work with him. I think a lot of people around the world will be absolutely dismayed if Trump gets elected again, given the role that he played in trying to overturn the results of the last election and his criminal convictions. But I think people are used to the fact now that the United States is an incredibly polarized country, and when you have just two parties competing, the reality is that either candidate can win that election. So, I think that the rest of the world might be dismayed if Donald Trump wins, but at the same time, it's a result that they're expecting. It's a result that they're prepared for.
Yeah, well, I don't know just how much anybody can be prepared for what's going to happen in the next 24 hours in America, but luckily we've got you to help us understand it. From the US Study Centre, Associate Professor David Smith, stay close to your phone. We'll be speaking to you tomorrow. You can bet on that.
I will. See you then.